plenary of the afternoon, Transformative Actions to Revive Green Climate Finance. We've got an excellent panel for this. We're going to have a keynote address from Mr Anand Kumar, Secretary at the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. And we've got a panel consisting of Dr Surendra Babu, who's Deputy General Manager, the Farm Sector Policy Department at NABARD, the National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development. We'll hear from Mr Deepak Bagla, Managing Director and CEO of Invest India, from Professor Kelly Sims Gallagher, who's Director of the Climate Policy Lab at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, Dr Adonai Herrera-Martínez, who's Director of Environmental Funds at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and last but not least from Mr John Room, who's Senior Director, Climate Change at the World Bank. And to chair these discussions, we'll be joined by Mr Deepak Dasgupta, Distinguished Fellow at TERI. So please join me in welcoming our speakers to the dais.
Good afternoon to all of you. Late afternoon, post-lunch is always the perfect time to talk about finance. We are nevertheless going to have a very exciting discussion because we have an extremely distinguished, but more important than distinguished, we have a practitioners panel, people who've actually been doing the financing and the transformation that we are seeing. One of the interesting things that Martin talked about throughout the last 2.5 days, periodically you see people talking about critical importance of finance. So they talk about technology and they say, but we also need the finance, and it runs right through the conference. So, and right at the beginning also we talked about so this session is really about transformative actions. What is it that the panel thinks is going to change the pendulum a little bit towards many points of time during the last 2.5 days, we always were presented with the graph which shows the track of GHG emissions that's going to be business as usual with the policy stances, and it doesn't blink. It just goes straight up, right up till 2050. And then the options is it has to turn dramatically in the next 10 years and beyond. And that turning point is exactly mirrored in a finance discussions. If we don't get the finance that the world needs in order to get to this path of 2 or 1.5, we don't make it in that sense. And the total amount of mitigation finance currently that is running at around $500 billion globally, about thereabouts. Numbers that I mentioned have high degrees of uncertainty in the ranges. Reporting is not clear. But it's up significantly. So we're doing about $500 billion a year, mostly in mitigation, very little in adaptation, of which around 350 billion is going towards renewables and solar. So that's why we are delighted to have Secretary MNRE with us, and he will present us a keynote speech on India's startling progress to date on that, but even more important, the prospects ahead. So we will then turn to our 5 panelists after the keynote speech, and each of you will talk, and at that point, I'll introduce all of you. So, Secretary, sir, the floor is yours. About 10 minutes.
Yes. My very dear friend, Mr. Deepak Dasgupta, distinguished panelists, distinguished guests, friends from media, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Deepak Dasgupta was saying that post-lunch session, and it is most difficult to speak, many say, but I say it's easier to speak because whatever you say, people are not listening.
No, we are listening.
So you can do away with whatever, I have not say crap, but whatever nonsense you may speak. But friends, nevertheless, transformative action to revive green climate finance. Now, green climate finance and financing of various sectors like renewable energy, they have got two different separate dimensions. We all know that SDG 7 focuses on affordable, sustainable, modern energy access universally. We also know that UNFCCC talks about for providing new and additional finance. Let me re-stress on this, new and additional finance, beyond ODA and the markets, to help the developing countries. But then the question is, how much of this new and additional finance has been provided by the developed world to the developing countries for enhancing the universal energy access? I'm sure you'll all agree, very limited. So we need to catalyze that. We need to put more forceful demand for this, and we must ask developed nations that they must earmark a portion of their investment portfolio for renewables on concessional terms. And unless this happens, the talk about green finance will not be practical. So this is when you are depending on somebody else to assist or foot the bill for your programs. In the interest of universal energy access around the globe for 1.25 billion people who doesn't have access to electricity, I, through you, appeal to the developed world to be true to their assistance and provide green energy finance to the developing world. India had around 14.1 gigawatt of capacity in 2010. In 2015, we reached the figure of 35 gigawatt. Today, as I stand before you, we have touched a figure of 86 gigawatt in the country. And we would reach the figure of 175 by 2022. And by 2030, we expect that out of 850 odd gigawatt of installed capacity, 450 to 500 gigawatt will come from renewable energy. In India and most of the other nations, renewable energy program has been led by private sector investment. When I talk about this 86 gigawatt here in the country, this has been aided by investment of approximately $100 billion investment. And to install the balance of around 90 gigawatt, we expect another investment of another $100 billion here in the country. But why should somebody come and invest in your country? He would definitely like to have a fair return. He is not coming for a charity. So leave aside the green financing, leave aside the UNFCCC mandate. But you as a country, we as a nation of the developing world and part of South, must develop those instruments which attracts investment from outside. The first mantra is for attracting investment, which I feel is a one sentence: your investment is safe. Once you tell the investor that your investment is safe, battle is half won. Then he can take risk on the returns. But the moment he finds his original investment is at stake, he will not come to your country. So what should we do for this? We should have proper contractual agreements. In renewables case, in power case, power purchase agreements. And these agreements, once signed, should not ever be renegotiated unless there is a clause to do so in the agreement or there is a case of corruption or malafide established. The risks of investment should be properly apportioned between the developer and the government. The risk should not be overloaded against the investor. So what we have done in India to attract investment is, the first thing what we have done is we have made our PPA stronger. We have defined the political and non-political risks. We have also defined the force majeure conditions, and we have said that we share the risk between you and us equally in a proportionate way. So first I said that we assure the investors that their investment is not at risk. Number two, we are toward that direction. We have strengthened our PPAs. India has got a very strong economy. We have got a very resilient judicial system, and we have got a very strong demand. So India is the right kind of market to be in. The only thing what we need to do is we have to create the environment for doing business here in the country. When we talk about the de-risking of mechanism, the investor has come, he has entered into PPA, we have assured him his contract is valid, but when it comes to making payment, we don't make payment in time. There has to be payment security mechanism built in. So we must ensure that whatever is due to the investor, it will be paid in time through a very strong payment security mechanism what we are developing and what we are developing here in the country. It could be also by means of letters of credit. It could also be by means of some kind of agreement which has got a backing of the sovereign. So the payment should not get delayed, and there should be a proper payment security mechanism. We must make proper amendments in the law. We must ensure that nobody questions the investment or the instruments or the contracts just by the way of it, like what has happened in one of the states, that one fine morning the state says that, look, I will renegotiate all agreements which have been signed in the last 5 years. This should be barred. And how can you bar this? You can bar only if you carry out the amendment in the Act and the law. So the law should say that agreements when signed are sacrosanct and cannot be renegotiated. So we must give the legal backing to all instruments which would take care of the security of investment made by the investors. Friends, in India what we are doing is that we know that getting green financing is not easy. Though we are trying to get help from World Bank through various lines of credit to support our rooftop programs and programs in renewable sector. We are more depending on our own initiatives. We have got a green bank called IRIDA. We raised our masala bonds to provide loans for the renewable sector. We are trying to open the green windows through IRIDA for providing assistance for the sectors which are not catered to by other financial institutions. And we are trying to develop our renewable sector's various segments by building the raising of finance within the tariff. Now let me explain you the last bit of it. You all understand masala bonds, you all understand green windows, you all understand financial institution giving it, etc. To de-risk investment, we require payment security mechanism. For making the payment security mechanism, I need some corpus, so that the intermediate buyer can make payment to the investors in time. But how do I get this corpus? I go to the bank or I go to the government, but then there's not enough money available for that. So what we have started doing is that we have started building this an element of payment security mechanism within the tariff. So if the tariff for the power is 3 cents, I charge 3.1 cent. And this 0.1 cent goes into the kitty of payment security mechanism. And just imagine this 0.1 cent coming in additional with every kilowatt hour. And if I build 100 gigawatt, what quantum of money I will have for the payment security mechanism. And this would help me out in assuring the investors that, friends, you will get your payment in time. Manufacturing is again a very important issue. Today, India, and especially the solar sector, we are at mercy of some of our neighbors. We import solar cells and modules in great numbers from there. We do have certain capacity of manufacturing solar cells and modules, to be very precise, around 3 gigawatt of solar cell manufacturing capacity and around 10 gigawatt of solar module manufacturing capacity. But then, as I said earlier, I want to increase this capacity. But how do it? I would require some kind of assistance from the government by way of subsidy. Government is not willing to give me that money, but I want manufacturing to come into the country. So another innovative way of financing what we did, or providing the subsidy, that when I'm buying power at the rate of 3 cents, I'm willing to give the tariff of 3.25 to the project developer, provided he brings in manufacturing capacity here in India. So we brought in this tender, which is called the manufacturing linked tender. So where I was paying 2 rupees 75 paisa for solar vanilla tariff, I was willing to give 2.92 to the people who will bring in this manufacturing here in India. And I'm very happy to share it with you that we got 2 bidders, 2 developers, to set up 3 gigawatt of solar cell, 3 gigawatt of solar cell and 3 gigawatt of solar module manufacturing by the 2021. So with this one tender, with this one way of innovative financing, I'm doubling the capacity of manufacturing of solar cells here and enhancing the solar manufacturing capacity by another 3 gigawatt. And now, the happier thing is that more and more people are coming up and they are saying, please bring in more tenders like this. And lastly, when we talk about the financing, the demands, etc., we must try to rationalize use of our national resources. There's a debate going around that we have got the standard thermal capacity. We have invested so much money in the thermal power station. Thermal, when I talk about thermal, it's the coal power station. And I'm not advocating that more coal power stations should come in. But if the renewables have to be there, if the renewables have to grow, then what we should do about the thermal capacity, the coal capacity? We have to ramp it down. But there is so much of investment which has gone in there, so which should go waste. So what we thought was, we thought about it from the national angle. We thought about for making the use of resources, because this also becomes part of the finance. So now we are bringing out the tender where renewables would be blended with the coal power, the thermal power, and it would be the ratio of 51-49. Because we want to tell the world that we are for renewables and we want renewables to come into the country because we want to reduce the carbon footprints of our economy. And gradually, as the demand would increase, so would be the share of renewables. Today is 51%, tomorrow it will be 70%, then it will be 90%, and then it will be 10%. So I am using my stranded assets, I am reducing the burden of the DISCOMs, and at the same time I am increasing my share of renewables. And to underline, I am doing the maximum use of my national resources. And I am not going to go my national resources waste. So friends, I would close with this remark that every rupee is important, every way to raise finance is important, every way to save the expenditure made is important, to make them as useful important. Thank you very much for listening to me, and have a very good afternoon.
Thank you, Secretary. That was very clear, crystal clear as to why India's been doing so well. I have to say, you know, the story about renewables and solar in India 10 years ago, when people were thinking, when we had made the ambitious plans, there was a lot of doubt whether we would be hitting those numbers. And it reflects itself in performance ratings when external ratings agencies look at how is India doing on carbon reduction. And you could see the numbers. We started quite high ranked, and then we're slipping down. And then this year we've shot back up. And the reason is, as you described, the story. It's an incredible performance. But more is coming, and we are going to be heading up to the 455 gigawatts. So the story, it's an interesting story in the sense that there's a ecology of making a new model work. And I think where India has proved itself well is we have dovetailed, as you've described, how we've got that. And in a sense, we don't need to worry about this sector. It's almost on, I shouldn't say it's on autopilot, but it has all the ingredients in place. You've got good policy, you've got financial agencies who are willing to take the risk, as you called it, but also the return in coming to India. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that Bombay has, or Mumbai has, many more pension funds setting up shop, and they can see the rates of return, risk-adjusted, that they're getting in India. So to that extent, I think of the space within low-carbon strategy, which is occupied by renewables and solar and wind, India is a grand success story. And the markets are working, the finance is coming, provided, of course, the policy settings are right. And as you described it, the policy settings are pretty much there, tweaking. Question that remains for India, I guess, is to get to 455, we'll have to triple or quadruple the level of financial flows towards the solar renewable sector. From $11 billion right now, annually, we'll probably have to go to $30 to $40 billion. But it's not a big sum. So the challenge that I would like to turn to next is to understand, is the same things happening and what are the nature of the financial challenges in a sector that we haven't talked about in this 2.5 days too much, and that's farming, agriculture, adaptation, mitigation. So I would like to therefore turn to my next speaker, Dr. Surendra Babu, who's the Deputy General Manager, NABARD, and he will tell us what is going on. About 5 minutes at this point of time for an introduction, and then we'll come back to questions.
Respected Chair, distinguished panelists, delegates, Basically, my presentation from the different angle, in the sense it is from the developmental financial institution perspective. Basically, just to tell a brief about the institution which I belong is NABARD. If some of you know, some of you may not be knowing. Basically, it's a development bank of India, we call it. Basically, the pan-India presence. Our role is basically, we are supporting to the banks and the development of rural infrastructure in India and the other developmental role, just like the today's this deliberations taking place. So my discussion basically would be relating to the NABARD perspective in the area of adaptation models we have created and the some mitigation models we have created, keeping the background of the what is the scenario of India, particularly if we see the adaptation features. Now we know that vulnerability aspect of Indian scenario, it's because of the high population pressure going to be, if we see that 2050 we are going to be 1.65 billion. And then our Indian agriculture rain-fed, 55% crop area is rain-fed. So therefore it becomes more important for us to go for those adaptation measures and ensuring the finance part for those measures. Now, the Government of India's initiative, I will not be going in detail basically, but some of the initiatives, particularly in the field of adaptation, National Adaptation Plan we have, basically this has given us a dynamic shift from the from the response to the climate change and the becoming a low carbon economy. Now we have the 8 missions and they are in different stage of the progress. Similarly we see in our Indian scenario, in states we have state action plans also. They deal with the climate profile of the states and the vulnerability aspects of the climate change in the states and the GHG emission, then what is the strategy and how those plans going to be implemented. Now keeping this background, the Indian scenario we see for the climate perspective alone, the requirement going to be 2.5 trillion. So if that much is the requirement for the adaptation and mitigation measures, then coming to the adaptation measures basically, which is mostly in form of grants, just like the action is being taken in India, basically mostly in form of grants. So there also the huge requirement, 206 billion is the requirement, USD is the requirement. Besides the government, our own funds, we need huge support from the international agencies and as also from the private sector. So various funding mechanisms are available. One is the UNFCCC support, wherein the Adaptation Fund Board is supporting, Green Climate Fund is supporting, then we have the JAP funding support. Then non-UNFCCC supporting is basically, if we see the UNDP, UNEP and FAO-ADB, these are the mechanisms available for the climate financing in India. Now multilateral agencies, they are also working in India, and also our national perspective, we have the fund, Ministry of Environment, Forest, they have created National Adaptation Fund on Climate Change. From there also the finance is coming to go for the adaptation project financing in India. Now, coming to the major part of my discussion is that what NABARD has done so far. Basically, since beginning of the NABARD in India, we have been into the field of watershed management, which is a very important tool for the adaptation finance, particularly for the community participation, as also the support to the farming community. On the similar line, in Indian scenario, we have 8% tribal population. For them, we have done a good work, more than 5 or half million population of tribal population. They are basically in the fringes of development. There and a lot of work has been done to provide them the sustainable livelihood. Various other measures also, so far the adaptation measures concerned, NABARD has taken up, just like system. Rice is a very important crop. How to increase the productivity of rice, our work has been very successful in India. Besides that, there are certain effective, innovative tools NABARD has been able to bring out. For example, NGO, through NGO, we have been able to develop the project umbrella program on nature resource management, wherein the NGO is going to the people and in form of grant and a loan support model. Those number of activities, particularly adaptation activities, have been successfully developed in India. Models have come up. We have our own infrastructure model for development, particularly renewable energy sector. We have done a good number of projects in India. And particularly the improvement in power sector, our role has been very effective. In order to create the awareness, we have come out with a climate change center where our major focus is how to support the community for the appraisal of the adaptation project, monitoring of the adaptation project, so that when the money is put into these projects, they become successful. So number of models actually, if I like to summarize here in this table, that is watershed development program, tribal development program, umbrella program on natural resource management, that has been a very successful model. Community, this capacity building program through our climate change center and funding approach. Applied research so far as the climate adaptation project is concerned. Various other funds, particularly through government support, Rural Infrastructure Development Fund, therein we are able to go for the green projects. That kind of project have been successfully. Plantation drive have come up in a very big way. Now, I don't want to go into this slide in detail. I'll just come to the three things and then suggestion. One is we are maintaining three important funds, international funds and national funds. That is Green Climate Fund, and NABARD is the direct access entity, and Adaptation Fund, we are the nation implementing entity. Besides that, we are the nation implementing entity of the Government of India Fund, wherein we have been able to touch more than 7 million community through our adaptation project. I have few suggestions before the panelists and all of you. Basically, if we really want to step up the green finance, particularly for the adaptation project in India, awareness is a very important tool. Innovative models, just like some of them we have indicated here, are really very good. They can be replicated. Fund mobilization is another issue, and the private funding. Here is only the role of RBI. Basically, for example, among the financing part, renewable energy is one. So, in place of renewable energy, we can put the green financing word. So, RBI can bring out the private sector lending guidelines in India. CSR can play a big role. So, these were some of my thoughts for the presentation. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. So the story that Surendra is saying actually goes a lot more, and NABARD is probably the single biggest bank in the world at this point of time in terms of scale in dealing with communities. It operates in every state in India, and it is decentralized. It has field offices. It works, the importance of field offices, it works with NGOs. So we are delighted that you've told the story, but it's a story that needs retelling in many ways. So I'm sorry we didn't give you enough chance to tell you, but you are also one of the first accredited agencies direct accredited with the GCF. And the question always arises, why did we pick NABARD and what is NABARD's role? There are two reasons. India is still heavily rural, still heavily farming oriented, and that's true for much of the developing world. And the scale of adaptation financing needs that we see in the next decade, while mitigation is the theme of the hour at every meeting, you must not forget about what's going on with communities, what's going on with the rural sectors, and we would like to be able to shine the spotlight on NABARD's activities because it's a lesson important to India, but it's also very important for the rest of the world. Switching tracks, we are now going to talk about something a little different, which is about how important it is the use of investment promotion and startups and getting innovation broadly done, both domestically and from externally. And we are delighted that we have Mr. Deepak Bagla, who is Managing Director and CEO of Invest India. Invest India, we will hear more about him on what it does and what role it plays in innovative financing and scaling up.
Thank you, Deepak. Welcome to the graveyard session. Thankfully, we had the secretary speak before us, so you were all awake. That was the interesting bit. And then you had Surendra, so he gave you about the biggest picture on the planet, as Deepak tells us. Let me just quickly tell you what we are about. So Invest India is one of the youngest kids on the block. We started in 2015 when the government came into power. It's the National Investment Promotion and Facilitation Agency of the government. It's actually the only platform currently where all the government of India and the state governments are all stakeholders together. There are 4 pillars. The first pillar is, this is the agency which goes out to seek investment from foreigners. And it does everything from them, right from showing them the opportunity to helping them with a business strategy, to bringing them to India, to helping them with getting all clearances, getting them a location, and then after the business is established, to helping them handhold the entire process. And that also takes it to domestic investors. So let me first explain to you my experience on that one. Before I do that, I must tell you that the UN has rated us as the world's best investment promotion agency in a short period of time in 48 months. And with that, I tell you, because we've done over 200,000 business requests, of which I must say, sir, your sector, and especially renewables, is my top 3 sectors of global interest in India. Food processing and renewables and infrastructure. And in fact, I've got the team sitting here, Pooja is here, and my other colleague, Siddharth. They're currently working on 1,400 odd projects, specifically on renewables. And they're doing everything as I explained to you on that one. The second leg of what Invest India does is it's also responsible for Startup India. And the third element is Agni, the accelerated growth of New India innovation, where they're picking up innovation and doing a fast track to it to take it to commercialization. Interestingly, in both the other 2 legs also, be it Startup and Agni, one of the top sectors is renewables. Again. It is very interesting. And in fact, if you look at that 20,000 crore fund which the government has allocated as a fund of funds to fund other startups, a large part of that is going into funds which are funding startups which are based on renewables. And there's some amazing stories coming out of that level of innovation and startup. And these are stories which are bottom-up stories. But let me take it back to the original point of financing. And that remains the crux. And in that, I go back to my previous life when I used to be a private equity investor, and before that as an investment banker. In fact, my director in my private equity fund is sitting right in front of me. Sir, good to see you here. I'll tell you what the challenge was. You said it's an interesting story. Stories are always interesting till they hit the climax. In that portion, we're driving us up to the climax. And why is that happening? The challenge happens when the social cost and the private individual cost are at great variance. We all agree that we should all be powered by wind or solar. But none of us are willing to pay the extra cost for it. You want the society to bear for it. Now, there's an element of creative destruction, where it is that when I started investing in renewables, when I started my private equity fund, it used to be $3.5 million to a megawatt. And by the time, sir, we finished, it had already come down to 980,000. So whatever investment I had made was obviously going downhill. That typically brings me down to the point, and that is the climax, where the social cost and the individual cost meet together. Now, we are not at that point yet. So when the secretary told us of the genuine ways they are trying to make up for that gap, that is the run-up where this entire exercise is required. Look at it traditionally. Core infrastructure, go back 5,000 years, or even 1,000, a few hundred years, was always built by resources either by the church or by the state, never by private equity. Right? because the returns were never that high to match. Private capital will always flow to the highest return. It's a no-brainer. All what we are trying now to do is to catch up and make up for that lack of return by coming up with these means. So one of the things which we are doing is the International Solar Alliance now has a joint venture with Invest India, where we're coming up with a platform where, one, we are trying to bring to you all solar projects which are happening across the globe. But more interestingly, why we are doing it, one is that it's for investors to get a menu of options they can invest in. But more interestingly, to see how these kind of de-risked models of financing are being adopted, and the success transfer then can be taken to other countries where it ought to be done, including creation of project exercises. I think de-risking and what the Secretary is doing is what is critical. At the end of the day, it's a risk-reward scenario. If you de-risk the product to an extent, the expectation of a reward from it also comes down, which is what you've done, sir. The moment you've said that your contracts have to be taken care of, and the moment you're giving them crowdfunding by everybody paying that extra cent, you're bringing that down on the cash flow basis. Now, those are the ones which are the ingenuine ones which we will have to accept going forward. The problem is, what is the legacy left behind? That is the biggest challenge which we are facing today. And if you remember, that is the challenge which Spain faced. When they went on the wind power ones, they were the biggest at one point of time. Is when the new guy coming in can give you a 2x efficiency at half the cost. Your project is no longer viable. The question today facing us in India is, how do we take account of those investments where that challenge is facing us? I think we are very fast approaching a point where the cost is coming down significantly, and I think after that the story is over. Then you go into a regular phase. But I think the question for us today is, and eventually that will have to come back to a point where we'll have to come to an ingenuine way to do it. I don't have answers, but I left you with questions.
Yeah, you have. So we're going to switch fields. The way that the panel came together, in a sense, you're getting perspectives of different kinds. And the three stories that you heard is about the progress that we are making in India on various ways. Heavily focused on renewable solar space, but also in adaptation. And now we'll turn to Professor Kelly Sims Gallagher. And she is a professor at Tufts. And although I know she has a broad remit looking at her papers, and I was hoping that she would tell us about technology and finances, but she tells me she'll tell you what she wants to talk about. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Secretary Kumar and Mr. Dasgupta, it's a real honor to be on this panel together with you. I'm going to focus my remarks on the role of national and state-level policy in mobilizing private sector finance. Because I think, a way to bring these conversations together is to think about how government creates the enabling environment for the private sector finance to flourish. And so far, we've been coming at that indirectly. This is based on a very recent paper we published last month, and it's available on our website if you're interested in looking. I wanted to start just with the magnitude of the challenge, and this has been referenced already in some of our earlier remarks. We have really large needs, upwards of 3 to 5 trillion, more than that, almost up to $8 trillion in identified needs. And then we have, for both mitigation and adaptation, actual investment much, much lower than that, somewhere between $4 and $5 billion by current estimates. So we have a gap of $3 to $5 trillion. And therefore, we must find mechanisms that more effectively mobilize private sector finance. There are some other puzzles that emerge. I think it's very important to realize that about 80% of climate-related finance is raised in the same country in which it is spent. So therefore, that reinforces the importance of understanding how national-level policy can mobilize finance. But a puzzle is that it seems that private sector finance seems to be contracting, according to recent data, even while public sector finance is growing. How is that? Is the public sector finance crowding out the private sector finance, or is there an alternative explanation? The key point here is that I just want to reinforce that still today our fossil fuel investments are twice the size of our climate finance on an annual basis. So we have a very large gap to fill. So what we have endeavored to try and understand is, in practice, which climate finance policies work, which don't, and why, which policies most effectively mobilize finance, which ones are most economically efficient, which ones are most equitable, so you're reaching all of the members of society, and which ones result in the best environmental integrity. I want to clarify that policies can target the demand side and the supply side. So policies can try to create demand for climate finance. You might think of carbon pricing, which I think John is going to talk about later, as one example of that. Or performance standards can also do that. But you can also think of policies as targeting the supply side. Those will actually increase the supply of climate finance that's available. And here, national development banks are a great example of that. Green bonds can be another great example. And very importantly, there's some policies that actually can link the two together. And you might think of that as, creating short, medium, long-term targets, just to help guide the country towards achievement of goals. So these are the various policy instruments that we examined in practice that countries have actually tried, ranging from green bonds to loan guarantees to tax credit instruments and development banks. And I know this is impossible to read. I don't want you to try to see this whole chart, but I wanted to just show we compared them across a number of criteria: stability, simplicity, transparency, consistency, adaptability. And just to give one example from the chart, I just say a word about loan guarantees. Loan guarantees are quite helpful because they can reduce risk for private sector investors. And in the United States, the loan guarantee program has probably been responsible for the fastest growth in utility scale solar than any other policy that has been tried. It is highly sensitive to politics in terms of how the loan guarantees are allocated, so that's a risk. We found in the United States that the application process was very complicated, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises. There was very low transparency in terms of the selection process, and then therefore it was accused of being more political than I think it actually was. The consistency of the availability of the loan guarantees depended a lot on annual budget allocations, so that predictability and durability was questioned. But it was easily adaptable. Goals could be changed. You could prioritize different technologies, different fuels, as the program evolved over time. And it turned out to be a very effective instrument at de-risking. So to quickly turn to our findings, we found that there's no single climate finance policy, no silver bullet, because they tend to work best when nested in a broader set of climate change policies. As we all, I think, know in this room, climate finance policy is highly skewed towards mitigation, and that's something that must be corrected, particularly in countries like India. Among all of the different policies, we found that feed-in tariffs, tax credits, loan guarantees, and national development banks are all effective at mobilizing private finance, but some are quite costly to national budgets, to taxpayers. And so that's a consideration that governments might want to consider. We found that national climate funds, targeted lending policies, disclosure, and green bonds could all theoretically be effective policy instruments, but our actual empirical evidence to date so far is weak or thin. And finally, that we see pros and cons exist for all of the policy instruments. There's a few important knowledge gaps that I wanted to point out. One is data availability. We really know almost nothing about the private sector in this regard, and this creates some risk of double counting and also duplication of effort in climate finance. This question I raised at the beginning about whether the public sector funds are crowding out private sector funds is an important question for us to understand. And actually, going back to Secretary Kumar's comment at the very beginning, this question of where is concessional finance really needed is an important one. If funds are scarce, we need to think about where you need concessional finance or whether you can use other instruments to mobilize the finance you're trying to get. I also won't go through all of these policy implications. I just want to mention and highlight three. The first is that a lack of clear government regulation or incentives can actually be very harmful. It can inhibit private sector finance because they lack certainty. And if they don't have the certainty about the national environment, they're not going to invest. Second, I think governments would be wise to choose investments that reduce financial risk rather than choosing direct subsidization instruments, because we see that most governments cannot sustain big subsidy programs for a long time. We saw the collapse of a number of feed-in tariff schemes, for example. And then finally, there is a need for climate proofing of all investments. We tend to forget that climate change is actually going to affect the investments we're making today. And so I wanted to highlight the importance of mainstreaming. And with that, I'll thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are all valuable lessons, and I'm sure we'll mull it over. We will switch quite quickly now. Between the market and government is really a space that multilateral development banks kind of straddle. And your role is an interesting one in terms of, is it an enabler of innovations, or is it also a direct lender? And there are, in this setting, we would love to hear from Adonai Herrera-Martínez, who's the Director for Environmental Funds at the EBRD, to what your priorities are, how big you are, what have you been, where are you focusing on, and any related issues. Thank you.
We're struggling, but we're trying our best. Well, first and foremost, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak at this impressive event in this distinguished panel. And I'll summarize my intervention on transformative actions to revive green finance in three segments: the role of NDBs, of multilateral development banks, the very unique business model by EBRD that focuses on private sector, and on the need of green standards to actually mobilize private sector investments. I would define the role of NDBs as catalytic, and it's been there for the last 20 years. NDBs have been quite effective in collaborating among themselves and with the countries where they operate in creating that enabling environment that Professor Gallagher was talking about to actually mainstream green investments in emerging and developing countries. Programmatically, MDBs have been actually quite successful as well in mobilizing grant funds, and you were talking about concessional financing before, to actually reduce the cost of capital of green investments. And that has been instrumental. I'll give an example later on. For example, the work the Global Environment Facility and the Climate Investment Funds hosted in the World Bank, or more modestly, the work of the Northern Dimension Partnership or the E5P that are funds that I manage in EBRD has been very important in addressing affordability issues, for example, in environmental investments. And I personally experienced this when I started working in EBRD 10 years ago in Turkey. We started working there. And one of the first projects, we managed to mobilize $50 million from the climate investment funds for blending with $250 million of EBRD funds for a credit line with commercial banks, and I mean commercial, for SME investments in energy efficiency. At first, the reaction of the commercial banks was quite reluctant. There was not a big offtake, but then when the awareness grew of the business potential for the banks, they turned into embracing the concept and mainstreaming of energy efficiency in SMEs. It was a very successful program that then mobilized over $3 billion in a few years for these type of investments. So that was extremely useful, not just to finance projects, but to give the bank, in this case, the EBRD, the gravitas to then approach the government and try to promote policy reform that would bring additional investment. And for example, we advised the government in developing its first National Energy Efficiency Action Plan and Renewable Energy Action Plan that then triggered the development of a renewable energy auctioning mechanism. And then that takes me to my second set of points on the EBRD business model. As opposed to the World Bank, which is traditionally described as policy-based lending, we focus on the private sector and on project finance. And we combine that project finance with technical assistance to our clients and policy engagement on very specific topics. And I mentioned before the auction system for renewables. This mechanism has been very successful in countries like Egypt or Jordan, where we also triggered those kind of policy reforms to promote renewables from 0 to gigawatts of installed capacity. For example, in Egypt, we financed the Bemban solar plant, the largest in Africa, 1.6 gigawatts. And thanks to that, we actually convinced the government in establishing those tendering mechanisms for competitive tendering. And this applies not just to renewables, because we've been hearing about renewables a lot, but also to all kinds of infrastructure investments. Infrastructure investments are a very unique asset class requiring very specific requirements, from long tenors to specific contracts, right? The high-level Global Commission on Energy, on Economy and Climate estimated last year that there's a need of about $90 trillion of investments in the next decade to actually invest on sustainable infrastructure. And that's very much in line with the number Professor Gallagher pointed out before. And it is clear that any infrastructure investment in the future will need to be smart and green, because otherwise we will have assets that are stranded, that are no longer up to date and have a significant impact on the environment, not just on emissions. So we need to actually put forward the tailored financing instruments like public-private partnerships to actually finance those type of investments all across the world, especially in our case, in our region. And for that, we need to mobilize private capital. And that takes me to a third point I wanted to make, which is the development of robust and reliable green standards. Let's see, private investors are becoming more and more demanding on the nature of the assets they invest in. And not just on return on investments, but on the nature of these assets, underlying assets, right? And to define that nature of assets, the environmental, social, and governance standards are key. And this has been very clearly underlined in Davos last week by the 4 big accounting firms when they subscribe to the WEF's International Business Council reporting framework. So it was very, very big news in terms of setting the right standards to rate investments. From our side, again, in a most moderate scale, we've been working with stock exchanges from Astana to Warsaw across our region to actually deepen the capital markets by establishing sustainability index rating standards. And in parallel to that, we've been working with those stock exchanges and with clients in order to standardize the ESG reporting systems that they use. And this work also supports the issuing of green bonds. We've been quite successful in helping, for example, Polish banks issuing green bonds, which is actually quite interesting, being Poland a coal-based load country. And perhaps in the future we might work on sustainability-linked loans. And for the later, in terms of, and I'll finish in a second, in terms of managing climate-related risks, we've now started working together with the task force on climate-related financial disclosures in order to assess our own portfolio and disclose the climate risk of that portfolio, and doing the same with our clients as well, in order to actually upscale the work that our clients do in terms of investment and mainstream the assessment of climate risk in the governance of our clients. And I think I can leave it here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we got a picture of your many different objectives that EBRD is doing. We're not that active in India as yet, but we hope we will be. Let me turn to John Room, Senior Director for Climate Change in the World Bank. And of course, John's been dealing with India and many other countries for a long time. We are delighted that you're here. And we'd like to hear what's been happening in the space. I was going to ask you whether you wanted to talk about carbon taxes and prices, but you don't have to. Tell us the stories about what are the few things that we should be watching out in the space. One thing I have to say to you, rooftop solar, when the bank was pushing it in India at an earlier stage, I wasn't sure whether it would take off that rapidly or not. But now, looking out of my window, everywhere I see, it's all rooftop solar. So kudos to you.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody, Secretary, colleagues. I was sitting here, I had some prepared notes, and as everybody was talking, a lot of it resonated. And I was thinking, well, what can I do? So I sort of restructured a little bit. And so I want to just step back a little bit and see the bigger picture of what we're talking about here, integrate some of these comments, but also to liven it up a little bit, be a little bit controversial. So I understood this earlier in this week, Lord Stern was here. So you must have heard about Lord Stern saying the magnitude of the problem, the scale of the problem, the urgency of the problem, and that the sustainable development path is the path of growth of the future. So this is huge. And I think that is what we need to focus on. We have to ask, is what we're talking about finance commensurate with the scale of that opportunity? And so what I would actually say is that it's not just about climate finance. Yes, the Secretary is right. There's the story of the 100 billion, the transfers from countries to countries. But in reality, this is not about climate finance. It's about making regular finance climate smart. People don't invest in climate. Governments invest in agriculture, roads, and water. Private sector investors invest in energy and motor vehicles. So the question is not what is climate finance, it's how do we make the rest of these investments more climate smart. Now, we talk about the private sector. If you look at what has happened, there's a large number of investors that have money that are investing in rooftop solars, are investing in concentrated solar. BlackRock just made these huge commitments to put the finance in. You could have someone here from Goldman Sachs telling you about the billions of dollars. As the Secretary said, if the market is there, they will come. It's not a shortage of finance. If you look at the amount of finance out there, it's in the trillions of dollars that's not earning big rates of return. The question is, how can we get the risk-rated returns equivalent so that that money that's just sitting there can move in? If we get that right, that will happen. Now, you can do things on the financial sector side. Central bank regulations, disclosure, that can create part of the incentives. But to me, the issue to make finance work is to create the markets. Longer term, we've got to figure out how to create the markets, and Kelly and others have talked about it. The basic idea is how do you, in the short term, balance the risks and rewards so that investments come in. And to me, the key is how do we use this to release the opportunities of innovation and coming down the cost curve. How do we make investments? So we make that first investments in rooftop solar, so the costs come down and they take off. Drive down the solar, drive down the cost of air conditioners, drive down the cost of concentrated solar. That is the key in terms of where we need to be focusing. Now, in the short term, how you structure financial deals is very important because the risk, perceived risk, might be too high. We worked in Madhya Pradesh to structure a deal that reduced the first set of perceived risks by improving the PPA, by putting some guarantees in place that drove the cost down to parity, grid parity with coal, but in the end, it created that market in the future. And this is where I see a huge opportunity for India. But I would go further than where the Secretary was. The Secretary focused on how do you create an opportunity for manufacturing of panels in India? Yeah, that's fine. But what's the bigger opportunity? How can India create air conditioners, batteries, electric vehicles at scale, putting in place the policy pieces that Kelly talked about to drive the costs down, crowd in the finance, and create the manufacturing opportunity? That's where I think our focus should be. In all of this discussion, let's not only focus on mitigation. Let's look at the adaptation. And in adaptation, to me, it's not about adaptation finance. It's about shaping largely public money in irrigation and water to make certain that it is climate smart. And this is not, if we simply say, we're going to do development as we did it before, and then we add some small amount of adaptation finance on top of it, we're frankly missing the point. The idea is, how should we be thinking about what does our road network look like so that those major road investments are planned with the future climate in mind, but not just the individual sections of it. How is that road system built so that it is adapted? And so in the whole space of adaptation, we need to first think differently about how we do development. Then we need to think about how we need to make the bulk finance different. And then how do we use the concessional finance or climate finance to change the whole thing? So basically, rather than focusing on the tail, how do we use the tail to wag the whole dog? Because that is the scope of finance that we need to move in order to achieve these objectives. Now, a key part of this, I will talk a little bit about carbon pricing and carbon markets. One of the key elements, as we all know, in creating this incentives is getting carbon pricing right. The technical argument is clear. Lord Stern, Joe Stiglitz, they've all explained the logic, not by itself, but as part of an overall package. The question is, how do you build political support for it? And there's two things I think are important. One, we just did a commission of private sector companies that came out and said, this is good for business. Mahindra was one of the leaders behind that. And the private sector can come and say, this is good for business to create the. Second thing is, the money that you raise from carbon prices, it's critically important how that money is used. Do you invest it in protecting the poor, doing the transition, investing in innovation, balancing your budget? The whole idea is not just carbon pricing, but how you move. Comment on carbon markets. We talk broadly about carbon markets. We did some analytics that showed that if you could equilibrate international carbon markets globally, the cost of NDCs by 2050 will go down by 50%, and you'd have $2 to $3 trillion a year flowing from rich economies to poor economies. Now, that's a bit pie in the sky. We're not going to get to that order of magnitude, but my sense is that despite the problems now on Article 6, we are going to get much bigger, much more dynamic carbon markets in the future. The economic rationale is just clear. But what does that mean? We need to start preparing now. The people that will benefit from those markets are the ones that know how to define an asset to trade, can create the trading platforms, can create the plumbing to make it work. So that's one of the things we're focusing on. So let me wrap with one final comment. What does this mean for the MDBs? Yeah, okay. All of our MDBs have increased our finance. We made a commitment to $200 billion over 5 years. Do you know what? It's irrelevant what that number is. It's how we use that number to do the kind of transformation I've been talking about, to leverage, create the markets, and how do we shape total adaptation finance so it moves. So to me, it's not a question of the short-term quantum of the money. It's how you use the money to unlock the private sector and public sector finance to achieve the scale and the ambition that is necessary to move this agenda forward. Thank you very much.
That's a perfect ending. I think John did a brilliant job summarizing the disparate thoughts that we had. And our thanks to Secretary for really presenting us a view, and to all the panelists on a difficult subject in a post-lunch period. Thank you all.